There is a loneliness that doesn't announce itself. It does not come from being alone, nor from being abandoned, but from carrying an awareness so sharp that it quietly separates a person from the rest of the world. People who understand too much move through life like silent witnesses. They hear what isn't said, notice what others overlook, feel the emotional temperature of a room before anyone else has sensed the shift. And because they understand deeply, they often speak softly. Because they see clearly, they rarely demand to be seen. Their loneliness isn't loud. It is woven into their empathy, hidden inside the moments where they swallow their own needs to protect the feelings of others. A loneliness made not of emptiness, but of depth. There are people who walk into a room and feel everything before they say anything. The tension sitting in the corner, the soft sadness behind someone's polite smile, the impatience someone tries to hide by tapping their foot under the table. They don't search for these details. Their mind collects them naturally, the way a mirror quietly reflects whatever stands before it. And long before they understand why, they feel slightly apart from others. Connected, yes, but also observing from a distance that no one else seems to notice. For them, awareness is not a skill. It is a weight they carry without ever being taught how heavy it truly is. They sense when someone is lying just to keep peace. They notice when a friend is hurting but won't admit it. They pick up on inconsistencies in tone, micro expressions that flicker for half a second, and the emotional temperature of people who barely know them. And because they understand so much so quickly, they often feel older than their years, as if their mind grew up before their body ever had the chance. This is where the loneliness begins, quietly, almost invisibly, not because they lack people, not because they are unwanted, but because the way they experience the world is just different. While others move through social moments lightly, they feel every shift, every hidden meaning, every unspoken emotional ripple. And that depth, which should be a bridge, often becomes a boundary. People appreciate them. They rely on them. They come to them for comfort, clarity, and emotional translation. But they rarely pause long enough to ask, who comforts the one who understands everything? It's strange how understanding too much makes a person both included and isolated at the same time. They are present in everyone's life, yet slightly removed from their own. They support others during heartbreak, conflict, confusion, guiding them gently, sensing exactly what needs to be said. But inside their chest, there is a quiet ache, the longing for someone who sees them with the same clarity they offer so freely. Someone who notices their exhaustion without needing it to be spoken. But this kind of person learns early on that most people don't listen beneath the surface. Most people don't notice the shift in their eyes when they are overwhelmed. Most people don't sense the sadness they mask with a reassuring smile. And so they shrink their inner world, not out of fear, but out of habit. They become careful with their words, soft with their needs, selective with the truths they reveal. Their understanding becomes a shield, a quiet protection that allows them to navigate life without causing trouble, without creating conflict, without burdening anyone. But in protecting others from discomfort, they slowly lose the space to express their own. There are nights when they lie awake replaying conversations, not because they regret anything they said, but because they felt everything too deeply. There are days when they appear completely fine on the outside, while internally carrying storms that no one ever suspects. And there are moments, small, fleeting, when they wish they could switch off their mind for just a little while and feel the world the way others do, lightly, simply, without layers. Yet even in their loneliness, there is a quiet beauty, because beneath that heavy awareness lies a truth they rarely name. Their sensitivity is not a flaw. It is the way they love. It is the way they understand life. It is the way they remain gentle in a world that often demands hardness. Still, the weight remains. The quiet ache of being the one who notices everything while hoping someone might one day notice them. It often starts long before a person has words for it. In childhood, when the world is still forming its shape, some children learn to pay attention more carefully than others. Not because they are naturally wise, and not because they are unusually mature, but because the environment around them teaches them, quietly, consistently, that understanding is safer than expressing. Maybe the home was unpredictable, not dangerous, not violent, just emotionally unstable in tiny ways that adults dismiss, but children absorb like air. A parent whose mood shifted without warning. A sibling who needed more attention. A household where speaking at the wrong moment sparked tension, but staying silent maintained peace. And so the child watched, listened, studied every change in tone, every sigh, every raised eyebrow, every door closed a little too loudly. They weren't trying to be insightful. They were trying to survive. This is where the sharpness of awareness is born, in the small spaces where emotional self-protection becomes inseparable from emotional intelligence. Some children become the easy ones, the quiet ones, the children who never cause trouble, who observe the room before they enter it, who adjust themselves like water taking the shape of whatever container it is poured into. Adults praise them for being mature. Teachers describe them as responsible. Family members trust them with secrets they should never have heard. But beneath that praise is a child who learned to anticipate others long before they understood themselves. A child who knew the emotional weather at home the way other children know the forecast on TV. A child who figured out that being aware, hyper-aware, kept them from being hurt, ignored, or misunderstood. For some, this awareness formed because they had to grow up early. Maybe they were the mediator between arguing parents. Maybe they were the emotional support for a struggling adult. Maybe they took on responsibilities that belonged to someone older. They carried too much for too long, and in doing so, their emotional radar became trained to pick up on subtlety, tension, and unspoken truths. For others, it wasn't chaos that shaped them, but the absence of emotional presence. A parent who was physically there, but emotionally distant. Someone who loved them, but didn't know how to listen. A home that valued achievement more than affection. So the child learned to understand others instead of expecting others to understand them. They became skilled at reading what wasn't said. They became the strong one, the thoughtful one, the one who quietly adjusted their behavior to keep harmony intact. But the cost of this harmony was simple and heartbreaking. They stopped asking for anything. Not because they didn't need comfort, but because needing something felt like adding weight to an already heavy world. These early years leave a mark that doesn't fade easily. By the time they reach adulthood, the ability to understand too much feels natural, automatic, instinctive. They walk into relationships sensing undercurrents before conversations even begin. They detect disappointment before it's spoken. They know when someone is drifting away before that person even admits it. And the loneliness grows not because they lack connection, but because their emotional instincts were shaped to protect others, not themselves. People look at them and see composure, maturity, strength. But behind those qualities is a child who learned to stay small so others could stay stable. A child who became the adult that understands too much, long before anyone tried to understand them. There is a quiet science behind the people who understand too much. Not the loud kind that announces itself through diagnoses or labels, but the softer, more intricate wiring of a nervous system shaped by years of emotional vigilance. On the surface, they appear calm, perceptive, and deeply intuitive, but internally, their mind is constantly scanning, noticing patterns, interpreting cues, stitching together meaning from threads others never even see. Psychologists often describe this phenomenon as hyper-attunement, a heightened sensitivity to emotional shifts and subtle interpersonal signals. It's not a flaw. It's not a disorder. It's the brain adapting to environments where emotional awareness was essential for connection, protection, or survival. The limbic system, the part of the brain that processes emotion, becomes finely tuned, almost like a radio capable of picking up frequencies others can't hear. A slight hesitation in someone's voice, a forced laugh, a delayed text message, a pause before a word that was meant to sound casual. To most people, these are fragments without meaning. But to someone shaped by emotional vigilance, they are data points that form entire emotional narratives. Neuroscience suggests that these individuals often have more active mirror neurons, the brain cells responsible for empathy, imitation, and emotional resonance. It means they don't just observe feelings, they feel them, absorb them, carry them. Someone else's sadness becomes a weight in their own chest. Someone else's worry becomes a quiet echo in their mind. This is why they can comfort others with such precision. But it is also why they feel drained after social interactions, even the gentle ones. There is also the psychological concept of compulsive empathy, a subtle but powerful instinct to interpret and soothe others before tending to themselves. It's the kind of empathy that is praised publicly, but often punished privately, because it leaves them emotionally exhausted in ways few people ever notice. Some researchers connect this trait to early emotional unpredictability, where a child's brain learns to anticipate others' feelings as a protective mechanism. In adulthood, the anticipation becomes automatic. They sense disappointment before it is expressed. They feel tension before conflict arises. They understand heartbreak before the other person has fully articulated it. But the same ability that helps them emotionally navigate the world can also trap them in patterns of responsibility they never asked for. Here lies the paradox. The more they understand, the more misunderstood they often feel. Most people listen to respond. They listen to understand. Most people hear words. They hear emotions. Most people see behavior. They see motive, fear, longing, and unspoken histories. This depth becomes isolating because it creates an emotional imbalance. They offer insight without asking for it. They absorb feelings without expressing their own. They decode others but remain largely unread themselves. And so people assume they are strong enough to not need help, wise enough to be above confusion, emotionally stable enough to never crumble. But inside they struggle with a psychological tension, the need to be understood versus the instinct to protect others from their inner world. They fear burdening people with their depth. They worry that others will not know how to hold their emotions. And so they speak in the gentlest versions of their truth, carefully edited, softened around the edges. This is the invisible cost of hyper-awareness, a mind that sees clearly, but a heart that remains partially hidden. Life lived in emotional high resolution, beautiful, yes, but overwhelming. And yet, even with all this understanding, the deepest loneliness remains unchanged. The fear that no one can meet them at the depth where they live. There comes a point in every deeply perceptive person's life where they begin to feel the quiet friction between what they sense and what they allow themselves to express. A subtle war between the emotional worlds they navigate and the ones they permit themselves to inhabit. And it is here, in this unspoken territory, that their deepest loneliness takes root, not in isolation from others, but in separation from their own unmet needs. They are the people who always know how to show up for others. They sense when someone is overwhelmed and offer softness. They notice when someone is hiding pain and create safety. They see emotional storms before they form and instinctively reach out with understanding. But this instinct, so natural and effortless, eventually becomes a double-edged sword. The more they soothe others, the more they ignore their own internal unrest. The more they give clarity, the more they become afraid to expose their confusion. The more they become the emotional anchor, the more they fear drifting away from themselves. Inside them, there is a quiet conflict. They long to be deeply understood, yet they hide the very parts of themselves that would allow someone to truly see them. Not out of dishonesty, but out of habit, out of fear that their depth will be misunderstood, or worse, mishandled. They've spent so much of their life being the stable one, the intuitive one, the one who gets it, that showing vulnerability feels almost irresponsible. People rely on them. People come to them for clarity. People turn to them in crisis, during heartbreak, in moments of emotional collapse. So they learn quietly that their own pain must be small, manageable, hidden, or postponed. And when they finally feel overwhelmed, the conflict intensifies. If they speak up, they worry they will be misunderstood. If they stay silent, they feel unseen. If they ask for help, they fear being a burden. If they don't, they carry everything alone. This tug of war shapes their relationships too. They can read a partner's disappointment before a word is spoken. They can sense emotional shifts before anything changes externally. They can love with attentiveness so deep it feels like being known through the skin. But they rarely receive the same level of emotional precision in return. Not because others don't care, but because most people simply don't see the world with that much resolution. And so they begin to shrink their desires. They tell themselves they don't need much, that they're strong enough, that they can handle it, that silence is easier, that understanding is safer than expressing. But inside an ache grows. Who understands me? Who reads me the way I read others? Who notices the moment my voice softens because I'm holding back tears? Who sees the sadness behind my smile? Who senses my tiredness without me naming it? There is also a guilt that lives inside them. A guilt for wanting reciprocity, for wanting emotional care rather than just emotional responsibility, for desiring a depth of connection that few people are capable of giving. They feel selfish for wanting what they give so freely. They feel unreasonable for longing to be known without explanation. This internal conflict creates a kind of emotional limbo. They are too intuitive to disconnect completely, too empathetic to be indifferent, too self-aware to pretend they don't feel the imbalance. So they continue living between two worlds, the world where they understand everyone and the world where they are rarely understood, the world where they listen deeply and the world where their silence hides unmet longing, the world where they give emotional safety and the world where they secretly hope someone will offer it back without being asked. In this quiet space, their loneliness does not scream. It whispers. It waits. It follows them like a soft shadow, reminding them of a truth they try so hard to ignore, that even the strongest hearts bend under the weight of carrying everyone else's emotions but their own. There is a day, sometimes quiet, sometimes abrupt, when a person who understands too much finally pauses long enough to hear the truth they've been avoiding. It does not arrive like a dramatic revelation. It comes softly, almost gently, the way dusk settles over a familiar street, a slow awareness spreading through the mind. This loneliness isn't accidental. It's a pattern, and I have been living inside it without noticing. It often begins with a small moment, a conversation where they once again become the listener, the interpreter, the emotional caretaker, and nobody asks how they're holding up. A night when they feel heavy and drained, but respond to messages with comfort instead of honesty. a morning when they wake up tired in a way sleep cannot fix, and wonder when they last felt emotionally held by someone else. In that moment, something in them shifts, not dramatically, not loudly, but with a quiet clarity that feels both painful and freeing. They finally see the invisible equation of their life. The more they understand, the less they are understood. And for the first time, they don't blame the world for it. They realize they've been participating in their own loneliness. They've been hiding their depth to protect others. They've been translating emotions for everyone except themselves. They've been solving problems they never created. They've been offering comfort before anyone even asked. They've been the safe place for so many that they forgot what it feels like to have a safe place of their own. This realization isn't a moment of anger. It is a moment of grief. A grief for all the times they needed someone but didn't ask. A grief for every version of themselves that softened their truth to avoid making others uncomfortable. A grief for the child who learned to observe instead of express. A grief for the adult who became a healer before they ever truly healed. They begin to question things they never questioned before. Why do I feel guilty when I need help? Why do I apologize for my feelings before I even express them? Why do I keep saying, it's okay, when it isn't? Why does giving feel natural, but receiving feels heavy? These questions do not break them, they open them. They create space for honesty, for the first time in years. And with honesty comes another realization. They were never meant to carry so much. They were never meant to be everyone's emotional translator. They were never meant to stay quiet to keep the peace. They were never meant to be the reliable one at the cost of their own exhaustion. But the most profound realization arrives slowly, like a truth the heart whispers before the mind dares to believe it. Understanding people deeply does not mean you must be responsible for them. This is the turning point, the soft breaking of an old identity. They begin to see themselves not only as the one who understands, but as someone worthy of being understood. They begin to sense that their depth is not a burden, but a way of being that deserves reciprocity. They begin to gently release the idea that love must always be earned through emotional labor. And perhaps for the first time, they feel the loneliness in its true form, not as a personal failure, but as a natural response to a lifetime of holding everything in. This moment of realization is not the end of their loneliness, but it is the end of carrying it blindly. It marks the quiet beginning of something new, the possibility of being seen, not just interpreted, the possibility of being understood, not just understanding, the possibility of finally stepping out from behind the emotional walls they built to protect others, and learning what it feels like to be met gently at the depth where they truly live. Healing does not arrive for them like a bright sunrise. It arrives like the slow lifting of fog, so gradual that they barely notice it at first. It begins with the smallest internal permission. I am allowed to feel what I feel. A sentence so simple, yet so foreign to someone who has spent their entire life prioritizing the emotions of others. The softening begins the moment they stop rushing to translate every mood in the room, the moment they pause before fixing a problem that isn't theirs, the moment they let someone else sit with their own discomfort without stepping in as a buffer. These are tiny shifts, almost invisible, but profound. Because for a person who understands too much, choosing not to carry everything is an act of quiet, revolutionary courage. At first, letting go feels wrong. It feels selfish. It feels like they're betraying the identity that others have relied on for years. They've always been the listener, the steady voice, the emotional interpreter. So when they finally take a step back, their mind fills with questions. Will people think I've changed? Will they pull away? Will they feel abandoned? Will they stop needing me? And beneath all of those questions lies the deepest fear. If I stop being useful, will anyone still stay? But healing requires them to confront this fear gently, without judgment. They begin noticing how their relationships function, which connections rely on their emotional labor, and which ones offer reciprocity without being asked. Who checks in on their sadness, and who only seeks them out in moments of crisis. Slowly, patterns reveal themselves, not to punish them, but to guide them towards something truer. The softening continues when they start practicing emotional honesty in small doses, not grand confessions, not dramatic vulnerability, but simple truths. I'm tired today. That comment hurt me. I need a little space. I'm not okay right now. These sentences feel heavy in their mouth at first, like they're speaking a language they were never taught. But each time they express a need, a real human need, something fragile inside them loosens. A knot they didn't even realize they were carrying begins to unwind, and something beautiful happens next. The world doesn't collapse. People don't disappear. The ground doesn't fall from beneath their feet. Instead, a softer reality emerges. Some people understand. Some people show up. Some people meet them with gentleness instead of expectation. And in those moments, their heart learns that connection can feel safe, not just responsible, organic, not just earned, reciprocal, not just one-sided. Healing also means unlearning the belief that they must always be the strong one. They begin to recognize that strength is not found in constant composure, but in the ability to be human without fear. They learn that boundaries are not barriers. They are invitations for healthier relationships. They learn that silence can be rest, not suppression. They learn that understanding others deeply does not require abandoning themselves. And as they slowly reclaim pieces of themselves, their loneliness begins to shift. It doesn't disappear. Depth rarely loses its shadows, but it becomes a different kind of companion, not a burden, but a reminder of their sensitivity, not a hollow space, but an inner room where they can finally breathe. The softening of the heart is not about becoming less perceptive. It is about learning that their depth deserves gentleness too. It's the quiet return to self, the first exhale after years of holding the world together. It is the moment they realize that being understood is not a luxury reserved for others. It is something they are allowed to desire, something they are allowed to receive, something they are worthy of. And in that realization, the heart slowly, steadily begins to rest. There comes a point in every deeply perceptive person's journey where loneliness stops feeling like an enemy and begins to look more like a mirror, a quiet reflection of who they are beneath the layers of responsibility, empathy, and emotional attunement. It no longer feels like a punishment for caring too much or understanding too deeply. Instead, it becomes a space where clarity finally has room to breathe. This loneliness is different from emptiness. It is spacious, not hollow. It is contemplative, not cold. It is the kind of loneliness that doesn't hurt. It hums. A soft frequency that only those who live in emotional high resolution can hear. In this loneliness, they begin to recognize the rare gift they carry. Not the gift of reading others, but the gift of feeling life with a depth most people never touch. Their mind doesn't skim the surface. It travels to the hidden layers. Their heart doesn't respond to noise. It listens for meaning. Their presence doesn't seek attention. It seeks truth. And the truth is this: people who understand too much often walk alone, not because they are unlovable, but because they inhabit an inner world that requires stillness, care, and emotional honesty, qualities that most people are not taught to cultivate. They begin to see that their loneliness is not a reflection of failure. It is a reflection of how rare their emotional depth is, how carefully they feel, how sensitively they love, how naturally they understand. And slowly, something shifts. They stop blaming themselves for the emotional imbalance in their relationships. They stop apologizing for needing reciprocity. They stop dimming their depth in order to fit into shallow spaces. They stop interpreting their loneliness as a flaw and start seeing it as an invitation, a reminder that their inner world deserves people who can meet them there. In this quiet space, they discover a new kind of peace, not the peace that comes from being understood by someone else, but the peace that comes from finally understanding themselves. They begin to cherish their sensitivity instead of hiding it. They begin to honor their boundaries instead of softening them. They begin to choose relationships where they feel seen, not simply useful. They begin to trust that the right people will not be intimidated by their depth, but drawn to it. This kind of loneliness becomes a guiding light. It shows them which connections nourish them and which drain them. It teaches them the difference between being needed and being valued. It reveals the spaces where they have abandoned themselves just to be present for others. And as they grow into this new awareness, their loneliness becomes less about longing and more about alignment, less about absence and more about presence, less about who is missing and more about who they are becoming. They learn that depth has its own rhythm, its own timing, its own way of bringing the right people closer and letting the wrong people fade. They learn that they do not need to explain their feelings to be worthy of love. They learn that they do not need to carry the emotional weight of others to maintain connection. They learn that they deserve relationships that feel like home, not work. And in this new understanding, their loneliness transforms. It becomes a sanctuary, a place where they can rest after a lifetime of emotional labor. A place where their thoughts finally have space, their feelings finally have volume, and their depth finally feels like a blessing instead of a burden. This is the beautiful loneliness, the kind that doesn't cage them, but frees them, the kind that doesn't isolate them, but elevates them, the kind that doesn't make them smaller, but invites them into themselves more fully than ever before. A loneliness not of emptiness, but of depth, not a void, but a landscape, not a wound, but a truth they finally learn to walk with, not in fear, but in quiet, luminous understanding.